Dead men tell no tales. Dead men tell no tales. Dead men tell no tales.
Good afternoon. My name is Irving Finkel, and I'm a curator in the British Museum in London. And today I'm going to address you under the title, Voices Out of the Darkness. And the voices in question are those of the ancient population of Mesopotamia, in their own words.
Who were the ancient Sumerians? Who were their gods they called Anunnakis? Curious one, come with us. Let's explore this ancient history in depth together. But first, a quick story. The quest begins. In a world where ancient mysteries intertwine with new advanced AI technology, a journey into the past embarks. Our story begins with a curious explorer, armed with the latest technological advancements, setting out to uncover the long-lost truths of the Anunnaki, as told through the eyes of the ancient Sumerians. Unveiling the past, as our explorer delves into the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization beckons with its untold stories. Here, the Sumerians, among the first to etch their existence into history's canvas, speak of the Anunnaki, divine beings whose tales are shrouded in mystery. The Sumerian Chronicles. Through the lens of advanced AI, ancient cuneiform tablets are translated, revealing the daily lives, beliefs, and cosmic understandings of the Sumerians. Each tablet, a piece of the grand puzzle, hints at the influential presence of the Anunnaki. Secrets of the Divine. Our journey takes a mystical turn as we explore the Anunnaki's role in Sumerian mythology. Were they mere deities, or did they possess knowledge and technology far beyond our comprehension? The secrets of the dead whisper tales of star maps, architectural marvels, and perhaps the key to immortality. The Anunnaki legacy. The narrative weaves through the remnants of ziggurats and temples as archaeological digs and technology unravel the Anunnaki's influence on Earth. Did they shape humanity's destiny? The secrets, hidden for millennia, slowly come to light, challenging our understanding of history and our place in the universe. Revelations. In the climactic finale, our explorer stands at the crossroads of past and future. The revelations about the Anunnaki and their ties to the Sumerians reframe our perception of mythology and religion. What once was myth now blurs with the reality, as the ancient gods of Sumeria are viewed not just as figments of religious fervor, but as key players in the saga of humanity. The journey continues. As our storybook closes, the journey of discovery is far from over. The truths unearthed about the Anunnaki and Sumerians ignite a newfound curiosity. With every secret revealed, more questions emerge, beckoning us to keep exploring the vast, uncharted territories of our ancient past and the infinite possibilities of our future. A call to adventure. We invite you, the viewer, to join in this quest for knowledge. Like, share, and subscribe to journey together into the mysteries that bind the realms of science, technology, mythology, and religion. Wowzers. Interesting story, right? So, who were the Sumers?
The picture before you on the screen is a cuneiform tablet from ancient Iraq, written in cuneiform writing. And under the title Voices Out of the Darkness, I'm going to show you a spread of ancient documents of this kind from that culture, not just for the sake of it, or just to convince you that cuneiform is the most marvelous thing in the world, but also to make a serious point which is rarely made by people who look at things from antiquity. Because I spent my life reading these inscriptions, most of it in the British Museum in London, and I've read a huge number of inscriptions in this kind of writing, and what's come out of it is my conviction that the people that we can see by virtue of what they left behind are, like we are, in very important respects. They're not another species, they're not less intelligent, they're not less interesting. They are, practically speaking, the same as we are, and if you met them on the bus, it would only be their clothes and their funny talking that might convince you that they were something unusual.
The ancient Sumerians created one of humanity's first great civilizations. Their homeland in Mesopotamia, called Sumer, emerged roughly 6,000 years ago along the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in present-day Iraq and Syria. The Sumerians learned to farm on a grand scale in the so-called Fertile Crescent, a thin, crescent-shaped sliver of Mesopotamia, often tied to the dawn of farming, writing, mathematics, and astronomy. And while the arid, ancient landscapes of the Middle East may not seem like the most likely location for an agricultural breakthrough, Sumer actually had a massive advantage. By settling between two large rivers, the Sumerians benefited from rich floodplain soil and ample water to irrigate crops. Their success was accelerated by Sumerian technological innovations like canals and plows. With time, Sumer got so good at growing food that they started to have enough resources left over to focus on building the cities and temples.
Well, kings, we had lots of kings. When you read history books, of course, kings are most important, who ruled first, how long they ruled, all that stuff. And of course, it's very interesting if you like that kind of thing. But there's a lot more to all this than kings. But it does mean that quite a lot of the inscriptions that we do have are of kingly type. Because remember, the bulk of the population were illiterate. And so if they were in a position that they needed some writing done, they would get someone to do it and they'd look after the document very carefully, but they weren't in the mainstream of a life with writing. But for kings, there was every reason to make the most of it. So the one at the top left is what we call a cone, and made of clay, and it's a shafted going to a point with a round head. And these cones were used as a decoration, as a kind of mosaic in a wall, different colours, for thousands of years before anybody had the bright idea that you could write on them. And so they used to write on them. What did they write on them? That the name of the god, the name of the ruler who built the temple, the name of the temple, the name of the city where it was, all in one go. So you can imagine that for an archaeologist, without inscriptions, they might dig in the same city for 50 years and not know where it was, but you turn up one of those and all the really big questions get answered straight away. So that's the most gratifying thing. In fact, this was a Sumerian ruler from southern Iraq in about 2200 BC, something like that, whose name was Gudea, and a bit earlier than that. He had hundreds and hundreds of these cones made so that nobody was ever in any doubt who'd made the building. And there was a serious point. It's not only that, there was a kind of panic in people's breasts that their wonderful building might fall to pieces, because if it's made of mud brick, you never know what will happen. And when you have an ancient building with these things in the walls, when it starts to crumble, they roll out. And the idea was in antiquity that a later king visiting the site out of respect and reading one of the, this was King Gudea. Well, we have to do something to restore this building. We can't let it fall to pieces. And it was a sort of message to unborn kings to perpetuate the reputation of a given king. And the thing at the bottom is rather curious. You can see it's a hand with the fingers folded over. And there's an inscription on near the knuckles. And that was once under a wooden roof. They were fitted there, so it looked from below as if the hands were holding up the beams. And that's an architectural feature, but in the palaces of the Assyrian kings, they like to put their name on everything for the same sort of reason.
Archaeologists walked the Sumerian city of Kish during excavations in 1932. Emergence of Sumerian cities. Roughly 10,000 years ago, villages started popping up across Mesopotamia. The people who lived in the region raised animals and grew grains, even as they continued to hunt and gather. Over time, those villages expanded and their people became increasingly dependent on farming. Archaeologists still aren't sure exactly what life was like for these early cultures. However, similarities in pottery styles and stamp seals placed on a variety of containers suggests some level of administrative control emerged between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago.
So if you became one of these scribes, there were basically two different directions you could go in. One was administration, and the other one was what we might call intellectual, if you'd like to call it that. We'll come to that in a minute. So the administration was a very serious matter, because at the time this tablet was written, for example, which is about 2100 BC, the temples in the different cities were entitled to have material, livestock and barley and all sorts of other things delivered for their needs on a very regular basis. And at the gate of the temple complex, there were scribes who had to write every day lots of these receipts. Such and such an amount of barley was delivered by Mr. So-and-so was in charge, and this is the date, and it's sealed, and it's a kind of receipt, a statement that this delivery had been made. So you've got 4 of these on the side. There are lots of them in many museums. They're all about an inch square, something like that. And sometimes they're very easy to read, sometimes not. But on the side, you have a ledger in many columns of writing, which is a summary of all that material, which at the end of the month had to be entered in by a rather officious person who was fluent in numbers and writing, who had the responsibility not to make any mistakes. And the thing is this, they very rarely make mistakes. They are very careful. So all the information from all these documents is entered into one of these depressing looking things, and at the end of it the totals are added up, because whoever did it was also going to be supervised by somebody else who would check everything as well. Perhaps that system sounds a little familiar to you. Perhaps in your own lives you might think of other things of this kind, where the remorseless documentation of tax and so forth is carefully written down and then checked by a certain type of human being who does it for a living.
Meanwhile, people started constructing a series of temples using mud bricks at a site called Eridu. The city seems to have been founded around 5400 BC, and it was occupied for thousands of years, until it was finally abandoned for good around 600 BC. Eridu's status was legendary even in ancient times. Babylonians actually believed that Eridu was the oldest city on Earth, having been created by the gods themselves. That kind of reverence attracted modern researchers, too. Even before archaeologists discovered Eridu, they had read about its existence in ancient texts. After kinship had descended from heaven, Eridu became the seat of kingship. One Sumerian tablet reads, "The area around Eridu was excavated a handful of times between the mid-19th century and the mid-20th century, turning up the remains of a once sprawling metropolis that saw successive buildings constructed on the remains of temples and other structures that had come before." Those digs did confirm Eridu as a real and truly ancient metropolis. At around 7,400 years old, Eridu is among humanity's oldest cities, but nowhere near the oldest. The current favorite contender for Earth's first city is Çatalhöyük, which sat just north of the commonly accepted edge of the Fertile Crescent in modern-day Turkey. Çatalhöyük was founded 9,600 years ago and also survived for millennia, disappearing just centuries before Eridu was founded. However, Eridu was just the beginning of Sumer. The civilization quickly grew to include dozens of cities like Ur, Kish, and Uruk.
So when you wrote a cuneiform tablet, you had a bit of clay, you had your writing stick, and this is a drawing from a children's book which shows the position of the hand. It's in the left hand with the writing stick held firmly in the right hand, and the individual strokes, the upright lines and the ones at an angle, each applied with the tip of the writing system. Now, when the Sumerians made the jump to writing, it looked at the time like a very big jump indeed. They had 2 basic tricks. One is called rebus, which means to do with things in Latin. And rebus meant that you could use a picture to write a sound not meaning the picture. So, for example, if you imagine a bee, zzz, and a leaf, you put them together and you can say, oh, this is a bee on a leaf, but actually bees usually go in the flowers, so what does that mean? But it also, you can read belief, the word in English, which has nothing to do with leaves or bees. And this was the brilliant conception that you could take all these signs, which were just pictures, and use them in a much more fluid and complicated and brilliant way to spell things like that. They're a bit like puns. And at the same time, they had another brilliant idea, which if you had a word that was a syllable, then you had a whole load of syllables. So the word Z might mean just one thing, but of course, if you drew the thing, you could use any time you wanted to put the sign Z down, you drew the thing. So if you wanted to write museum, which of course is a very important word, then you'd have a sign that went mu, one that went Z, and one that went and you write them together, spelling museum. So if you did that, a Sumerian who'd never even been to London would identify with a label that the British Museum was a museum. Now, the funny and ironic thing is that on the London Underground, if you sit in your seat and look at your fellow man opposite, you often see people with a mobile electronic device and a writing stick, which they hold in exactly the same way, and they do exactly the same thing as a cuneiform tablet. And those phones are made to fit in the hand, they're the right size. So were those clay tablets thousands of years before. And the other point, which is worth bearing in mind, that people who use these devices often don't bother with grammar or sentences or all the important things that writing allows, but they write things like the Sumerians did. Before and later are a kind of device that any Sumerian would immediately recognize.
As Sumerian cities exploded in size, Sumer emerged as one of the world's first great agricultural societies. In time, Eridu would fade in influence and Uruk would take on an outsized role. At its height some 4,800 years ago, Uruk was the largest city in the world. Some estimates suggest the city held as many as 80,000 people at a time, when the total human population was somewhere around 15 million. A map of the cities of ancient Sumer, which covered much of modern-day Iraq.
So we start off, of course, with a map, just to be careful. So in this small and easy to understand map, the important place to focus on is modern Iraq. And modern Iraq, as you can see, is between Syria and Iran, with Saudi Arabia down at the bottom and the Persian Gulf. It is that interesting shape, and the central feature of it is defined by the two border rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. They are of huge importance to ancient Mesopotamia. They are the reason we call it Mesopotamia, because the potamus bit means river and meso means between, and the potamus bit is the same thing as in the word hippopotamus. So there aren't hippopotami in those rivers, not today at any rate, but the thing about them was they brought an endless supply of water and irrigated the landscape in such a way that it became a very fertile part of the world for a very long time, and all sorts of things happened when that started. So this is the next picture shows you an ancient archaeological site in Iraq. You can see it's hot, you can see it's largely barren in the immediate area, but the thing is that the water supply which came down from the north was of such unstoppable benefit that they fast learned in very remote times to irrigate the land, to make it sprout, to make it green, so that they even had a surplus of corn and barley and yield, and they became stimuli for the beginnings of really serious settlements, and in time, history in the form of persons with a memory of their own past, living in what we would call cities. So on the left, you have one of these life-giving rivers, and they bear very strongly not only on survival and food, but also on the question of writing. Now, in ancient Mesopotamia, as far as we know, what has been excavated are the oldest forms of writing known to archaeology. And the reason is this, that the people, the Sumerians they were called, who lived there, who first developed this idea, used clay from the banks of a river like that, perfectly good clay, sometimes for pots, sometimes for other purposes, but also as a writing support. They used to make a nice flat surface which they could do their writing on, and they used for that purpose these reeds which grew in abundance. They were cut sharp into a sort of stylus, and so you have free clay and free writing sticks for all time to come, with the extraordinary point that these objects of clay buried in the ground could last, and do last, for thousands of years.
Sumerian technological innovations. Innovation was one of the key factors in the Sumerians' efforts to turn the desert into an oasis. And one of their most beneficial innovations was also among the simplest, the plow. The first plow appeared about 3500 BC, and by 1500 BC, the Sumerians had also invented a cedar plow. which let farmers use beasts of burden to till and plant at the same time. The devices even came with instructions, courtesy of the Sumerian Farmer's Almanac, which told farmers how to boost their crop yields thanks to tilling and irrigation. All the efficiencies helped support a growing population, as well as a growing system of rulers and religion. And as their cities grew, so did their efforts in writing, math, and religion. As far back as 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians had developed cuneiform, one of the earliest forms of writing. Sumerian inscriptions on clay and stone tracked the trade and movement of grain and other goods, recorded Sumerian history, and even included cooking recipes and pornography. Thousands of Sumerian tablets still sit awaiting translation in museums around the world.
So the thing about this writing system, this is not going to be a boring lecture with lots of horrible facts, but there are a couple of important facts. One of them is this, that about 3,500 BC, which is more than 5,500 years ago, these people who lived by those rivers in Mesopotamia came up with the idea of writing. And the principle was that you made characters in a very simple fashion, rather like a child would draw, because that would depict what you meant. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, you have an ear of barley with some numbers. Circles are numbers. And you can understand straight away that it means such and such a quantity of barley. So already you are fluent in the cuneiform writing system. In fact, this isn't quite cuneiform, it's before cuneiform, it is called pictographic writing. The reason being that the scribes, using their stick from the riverside and the clay from the river bank, drew with a point in the clay what they wanted to communicate. So the one below shows a man's head and a bowl of food, and those two signs together write the word for ration. So in the Sumerian language, the word for barley and the word for rations existed in their tongue. So when you first started out writing, you did a picture of something. Well, that was just a picture, but you can't really do writing with that. You can't explain anything complicated. So the script exploded in a very brilliant way from just simple pictures to being able to write sounds. And that is the most important contribution, in my opinion, that was ever made in the history of Homo sapiens. Because moving from childish drawings like that to signs written on a tablet where the words and grammar and ideas of a message could be recorded so that another person could read them, and people like us 5,000 years later could read them, made history itself possible. This was the first time that it was possible to record information for the future so that people could make sure the information and experience and know-how wasn't lost. So you see in the blue chart how the signs, they changed a bit. They started out like 5-year-old drawings, then they lay down on their sides, and then in the end they decided not to draw them anymore, but to use that stylus, like a chopstick, to press into the clay to reduce the signs to straight lines. So you can see, if you look at the orchard one, there are lots of little lines to show trees standing in the water. But by the time it evolves to the proper cuneiform shape, it's much different because all the lines have become straight because they are written in this funny way. If you've never seen one of these things before, it might strike you as very bizarre, but as a matter of fact, when the jump was made from little pictures to proper writing signs, it became possible for people who were trained to record their own language and other languages too, as we will see.
The Sumerians also invented or utilized a wide array of other more modern-seeming innovations like wheeled chariots, the 60-minute hour, and even possibly the first written work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. These proto-cuneiform tablets were discovered at the Sumerian city of Uruk. One clay tablet discovered at Eridu, as well as others found elsewhere in Sumer, also tells a flood story about a deluge that mirrors the one found in the Bible's Old Testament. Biblical historians call it the Eridu Genesis story. According to the tablets, it was the gods who first told humans to take up living in cities in Sumer. but eventually the gods decided to wipe out the human race with a deluge. According to the myth, one particular god, Enki, tipped off a Sumerian king named Ziusudra that he should build a boat to save his people. The idea that the flood story would have been passed down from the Sumerians makes sense for other reasons too.
Now this writing, cuneiform, you may by now regard it as an old friend, is quite unlike the alphabet. It's quite unlike modern writing, because using the devices of rebus, as I said before, and syllables, they cultivated a system that they could spell anything using syllables, and it became a very, very sophisticated and fluent and mobile system. You can see here, I hope, some of the clarity of the writing, because the wedges are sometimes upright, sometimes horizontal, and sometimes to an angle. And the scribe who wrote this document was a master calligrapher. This is the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So we have lots and lots of kings in Mesopotamia, and we have a few really corking heroes, and we have lots and lots of gods and goddesses. There's ample supply of all of them. So that means there's all sorts of mythology, some of it rather clear and exciting, some of it rather obscure, and often it's not complete. But the story of Gilgamesh, who was the hero for good and all, and certainly inspired many heroic piece of literature that came afterwards, was written on 12 tablets, and this is the one about the flood story. And if you've never read that story, I strongly think you might find it exciting, because Gilgamesh was a hero of highest water, highest quality. I thought you might like to see these 3 images of characters who star in the Gilgamesh narrative. So Gilgamesh, among other things, had to fight with the bull of heaven. And here on the left, you can see a bit of a coloured terracotta. It's only about 3 inches high, where Gilgamesh is triumphing over this very bull of heaven. He's got him in a hold where I think unless the bull bangs his leg on the floor 3 times to be released, he's had it. So the story of Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven is one of the big episodes. The one on the right, that fellow there who has divine headdress, it has been suggested that this is a picture of his friend Enkidu, who was a wild man who became civilized and became inseparable companion to Gilgamesh, and they had adventures together. Whether it is meant to be him, I don't know, but he certainly is the sort of thing, and it gives you an idea. And also it's rather realistic. If you look at that particular terracotta, if he sneezed or, winked at you, you wouldn't jump. And then down below, we have this wonderful portrait of Inanna, or Ishtar, the goddess of love, holding this special symbol of life and rather scantily dressed, and it's part of a much bigger picture. But there again, the funny thing about these 3 is they're almost like photographs, and they're only miniature sculpted works by wonderful artists, but somehow, like this, they look like people who might have lived. Of course, they were all a bit larger than life. Ishtar was a goddess, and Gilgamesh was only part divine, and so was Enkidu. But in the Gilgamesh story, when there's a poster for the Gilgamesh film, they will be outside on the poster, starring X as Gilgamesh, Y as Enkidu, and guess who as Ishtar. Well, while we're on the subject of kings, Mesopotamia had some jolly good kings. I mean, if you're thinking of the top 10 kings, this guy has to feature. His name is Ashurbanipal. He was king of Assyria. He lived in Nineveh in the 7th century. He was the tallest, most handsome, strongest, most intelligent, most virile, brave individual who ever walked the earth, and thus is depicted on his sculptures. It's perfectly possible he was rotund and greasy, overweight, and wore a black beret, but we don't know this. All we know is the official opinion. So he was a warrior and an effective king like nobody's business. He was a really serious, wonderful king and ran an empire far beyond the limits of his own country, but at the same time, he was a scholar. So he was one of those rare individuals that wasn't bloodthirsty to the exclusion of thinking. And in fact, he was trained as a boy to be a priest. He wasn't expecting to become king, and he was taught cuneiform by a very learned scholar who was very proud of his work and made him into a good scholar himself. So you have this portrait of this ruler, feared all over the place, but at home in his palace, he had one of the greatest libraries ever assembled in antiquity. Fortunately, we found it. So I have to show you portraits of the kinds of persons. The oldest language, the first language we see on these clay tablets from the very beginning, are the Sumerians. This is the Sumerian priest. It's a pious man with large eyes and large ears, carved in stone, and he spoke the Sumerian language. He's in the British Museum, and it's a great pity that he will never answer questions or smile back or make any response at all to any curator who lingers in front of him confidentially wanting to ask a question. Because we would have many questions for a Sumerian like this, because the language that they spoke is not like any other language that's ever been discovered. It's not related to any kind of language. It stands on its own. And when you first study it, it is quite strange and quite bizarre. And all the words that you know in the world and all the language things you've discovered and all that, none of it's any use. It's a quite different thing. So it's rather interesting that the first the first language that we have written down is not like modern or even other ancient languages at all. It's a rather special thing. Then a second one is what we call Akkadian. And what you've got here is a wall painting of an Assyrian scribe. And you can see he has a tablet in one hand and his writing stick in the other, and he's there writing out a document. And the thing about him, he spoke Akkadian. Akkadian is also extinct, and it came along a few centuries after Sumerian. They both lived side by side in ancient Mesopotamia. There were two languages going on. This Akkadian language, although it's dead, is closely related to many languages that do still exist. So, for example, if you speak and read Arabic or Hebrew or Aramaic or Ethiopic, any of that family of languages, you would understand when you saw some Akkadian written out in English letters that it was a sister language, and you could understand how with time you might get the hang of it. So there are two completely unrelated languages, Sumerian and Akkadian, written in the same cuneiform writing system. So when you see a tablet, you have to work out which language it is. Now, the first point is, and in the modern world, one has to make some kind of apology for this. It was really only boys who went to school to learn to write, and only from certain families. So you didn't have a situation in that remote antiquity where everybody was literate, only a minority. So it's a funny thing to visualize that when we look at these documents, when we put together in our own minds a kind of summary of their thinking or what their ideas were, the only people we can communicate with are people who'd gone to school and learned to write. Otherwise, there would be a chilly silence. So when you went to school, probably about 5 years old, you had to learn how to make a clay tablet, and you had to learn about a writing stick, and then you had to learn the signs. That's quite a lot indeed. Now, if you see on the left, you have a round, it looks if you put it in the oven and baked it, it might be quite tasty. You have a round tablet with writing on both sides. And this is an interesting thing, because if you were a boy who went to school, the classroom wouldn't be very many children, probably at once 6 or 7, and they might be of assorted ages. So when the younger one, a new recruit, arrived, what would happen is the bulk of the teaching to which he was exposed was carried out by one of the older boys, not by the master. So the first thing you did is you got some of this lovely clay and you rolled it into a ball, and then you flattened it to make one of these small cakes. And then the older boy took his writing stick and he ruled lines across the surface, and then the signs were hung, impressed on the tablet, hung from the line, a bit like washing. You can see that each sign has its head tucked on the writing line. So the older boy would write these lines. In this case, it was a proverb, and the younger boy would look at this very carefully for some time until he thought he could remember it, and then he would turn it over and from memory reproduce the same inscription on the other side. And what is interesting is that we have quite a lot of these tablets, and sometimes there is the most alarming discrepancy between the writing on the good side and the copy. Now, we know quite a lot about what went on in the schools. One of the things that went on quite regularly was that boys who didn't work properly were beaten with a stick. Rather a good educational system, in my opinion. So the master might be violent, or he might be ironic, or he might be uncomfortable, but he was the authority, and if your copy wasn't good enough, you'd have to do it again, but you might also get into trouble. Now, on the right here is a photograph of another round tablet. It's a close-up on a drawing on the surface. There's no writing here. And if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you can see the curve against the background, which shows that it's a close-up of a bigger round thing than we can see on the screen. The reason why it's a close-up is this. If you look carefully, you will see it's a human face. And there are two features about the human face which certainly need to be concentrated on. One of them is the hairs sprouting out of the nostrils in a rather weaselly and unpleasant sort of way. And then if you look below there, there's a very, very small curved mouth of disapproval at the bottom. So this drawing, which was done in about 1750 BC in a classroom, is obviously a caricature of the teacher.
In modern times, Sumer has captivated everyone from archaeologists to ancient alien conspiracy theorists. But the fascination with Sumerian society goes back much further in human history. Both the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, which rose to control parts of the Middle East as Sumer faded away, continued using the Sumerian language in their religious rituals for millennia. Excavations of Babylonian homes have uncovered tablets inscribed with the Sumerian language from long after the civilization itself was gone. And the Babylonians, who created the first star maps, seem to have inherited some of their knowledge of astronomy from the Sumerians as well. The Babylonian people had two sets of constellations, one for tracking farming dates and another to recognize the gods. The latter was passed on to us today thanks to the Greeks and formed the foundations for the 12 zodiac constellations. And the star names that they used seem to date back to the Sumerian people, implying this ancient civilization had a seriously sophisticated knowledge of much more than the earth below their feet.
Okay, we are nearly through. But I just must tell you something else, which is thought-provoking and not to be forgotten. So the Babylonians, in their wonderful writing system, could write numbers. And here you see the numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc., up to 10, 21, 31, 41, 51, and 60. So as you go up, you can see for yourself very simply that the numbers 1 to 9 have up to 9 upright wedges tucked in neatly. And then the 10 is a diagonal. And then 2 diagonals and a 1 is 21, and so forth. See, now you know how to use the numbers. It's like falling off a roof. And they had roofs, so you could fall off them. Now, the interesting thing is, the number 1 is 1, and it's also 60. The same single upright wedge was 60. And the reason for this is the Mesopotamians had a sexagesimal mathematical structure. So they didn't use 10 like we do, a decimal system. Their fundamental working platform was the number 60, because for mathematical reasons, it's more flexible and very more useful for their purposes. So for 3 millennia, 3,000 years, all the mathematical material in Mesopotamia and all the astronomical material and anything that used numbers used 60 or parts or multiples of 60. Now, this had a very, very serious consequence for us. Here at the top, you can see this very wide tablet with narrow rows of numbers. They're all numbers, and they are the first and last visibilities of the planet Mercury as seen from Babylon in such and such a year, because these astronomers were very careful to collect this data in neat columns. They recorded it, and of course for the history of astronomy and for contemporary astronomers, it was gold dust. And it was gold dust in such a way that the astronomers in Greece, who had already had their sciences advanced to a sophisticated level, got wind of the fact that in Babylon, the astronomers in the so-called university, in the college, had records going back as far as they could imagine of this type with hard astronomical data in them. And so some of them went to Babylon to find out. And we know this is true for two reasons. One, there are a few manuscripts. This is a little photograph of a bit of a manuscript, which is it's a parchment, it's ruled in ink. You can see there are columns and there are rulings left to right, and there are numbers in the columns. And the numbers on that Greek papyrus occur in this tablet. The numbers are so idiosyncratic that they couldn't arbitrarily have come into reason, they couldn't have arbitrarily come into existence for no reason. But it's certain that this is a transcription into Greek script, Greek number script, of the data on tablets of that kind. So some Greek person in Babylon sat at a table with one of these tablets and transcribed the numbers in his own familiar Greek script and took it home with him, and many, many other such pieces took it home with him in order to develop the science on the basis of observations which they didn't have. And you might think that this is a rather fanciful explanation, especially on the basis of such flimsy-looking material. But let me go back to school, as we began, with this marvelous thing here. This is a tablet. On the back of it, the other side, there are the words in cuneiform for canal, because, as I said, irrigation was the most important activity of joint contribution. So in the Sumerian language, the one we began with, the oldest language, the word for canal is palal in green. And to a Babylonian or an Assyrian who spoke Akkadian, the word for canal in his tongue was atapu. So on the other side of the tablet, we have palal in Sumerian next to atapu in Babylonian. It's a bilingual list of words, Sumerian in Greek. And on the back, the scribe has written these words in Greek writing. Okay, they had music. You can say, of course they had music. We know they had music. And you can see this Sumerian thing. They're having a banquet. This is the ruler with a good cup of wine and a musician here holding this lyre with a bull's head. But the miraculous thing is that we have one of these lyres. It was found by Sir Leonard Woolley. All the wood was rotted away, but all the contents were there in the soil, and the whole thing was gradually, carefully enclosed in plaster and excavated in the museum so that all the bits could be set in proportion, so that the instrument can be restored as it was in terms of size and the length of strings even, and then it made it possible to do research into the original tuning, because there's a cuneiform inscription with the tuning on it. And so now we know about the Mesopotamian music much more than we used to. We have a very good idea of what it sounded like. And when you consider that not only comes out of the silence and comes out of the earth, but comes out of irretrievable loss, and it's actually possible now, thanks to some remarkable work by a scholar called Richard Dumbrill, that we can actually bring this music to light. We don't have any of their music, but we know what the tuning was like and the intervals were like, and we have an idea of how it works. So that, I think, is a triumph of remarkable nature. Then, of course, they had board games. Now, there are 2 points I want to make here. That this is a board game from 2600 BC from the city of Ur. And in the top left-hand corner, there is a tablet with the rules on, written in the 2nd century BC, all that time afterwards. So we know how this game was basically played in antiquity, and it was popular all over the world. So that's quite an interesting little window too. You read the inscription, you open the window, next minute you can look through at people playing in a pub, getting drunk, getting angry, cheating, hitting one another over the head with a board, and all the other domestic facets of a good board game, which applied then and still apply now. But the most interesting thing is this. When you read the tablet, you discover that that tablet, which is in the city of Jena, has about 70 games. And the first thing I thought when I started to work on it was, what about this Bruegel painting, which is this very famous painting of children's games observed in detail all together, and there are 87 of them. Now, the thing is, nobody in the world knows 70 games that children play. Even if you count the most extreme variations, no one can think up 70 or 87. You have to collect the information. You have to ask old people what they did when they were playing in the street. What did you call this and what was it for and all that. And so the Bruegel painting is put together after a lot of research and taking things out of books and making a list. But what is instructive, the most important point is, that in Babylonia, it's about 1500 BC, there are about 70. There might have been a few more because the tablet is broken. And when you have a full color picture like this from medieval Europe, the total that Bruegel had was 87. So that it means that a society, you might say, could support something around that number, but hardly more than that. And that is not surprising because, you know, when you divide them up into fights and races and hoops and dice and things, there are categories, and you can't have endless varieties. But it is quite remarkable that in this Jena tablet, almost all of the names in Babylonian are unidentifiable. But it's very likely that the activities are all in this picture because of the obvious nature of the human being. So the question is, would it ever be possible to try and match them up? I think it might be rather a good adventure. So here we have the last bit of kingly stuff I want to show you. This is the Cyrus cylinder. It was written by King Cyrus of Persia when he invaded Babylon in 539 BC. He put an end to the original history of the Sumerians and the Syrians and the Babylonians, who all came to the end in 539 BC. The Persian Cyrus was on the throne, and that was a whole new period in Mesopotamian history. And Cyrus had this marvelous cylinder written out to explain the difficult thing to the Babylonians, the Iraqis, that from now on, a Persian was going to be in charge. And the way he did it was he wrote an inscription on this famous cylinder explaining how the Babylonian god Marduk had picked him out over the border in Iraq, what it was Iran, it was Persia, picked him out, singled him out and said, Cyrus, when you grow up, you are going to be king of Babylon under my protection. So he put the invasion cleverly as being due to the king of Babylon. Marvel, a master stroke. And it's such an important text that this was loaned to the Tehran Museum a few years ago. It's the first time it had been there, and there was a tremendous response. You can see all the photographers going like it's a film star, and in a way it's a kind of film star. It's such an important thing. So there we are, the Cyrus cylinder. It's now safely back in the museum and being looked after properly.
So while the Sumerians may have disappeared thousands of years ago, their influence and intrigue has continued on into the present, shaping aspects of modern society we all take for granted today. Well, that's all, folks. Stay safe until the next video. In the meantime, leave a comment or two and let us know what you think. Think of our description section as a treasure map, leading to the hidden jewels of meggdigital AI and the literary riches of ZenFBA books. X marks the spot, but only the most daring explorers with a shovel for wit will uncover the bounty. Thank you for watching meggdigital AI. Until next time, happy living. Visit meggdigital.com for a wonderful collection of gifts and gadgets.
Dead men tell no tales. Dead men tell no tales. Dead men tell no tales.